In the winter of 1827, in a small Pennsylvania town shrouded by fog and the rigid codes of morality, a boy was born who would not simply grow. He would disrupt the very foundations of what science considered untouchable. No one knew his name at first, and the townsfolk whispered about the child whose cries seemed to echo with something older than human memory. From the moment he opened his eyes, they said he saw too much. Not the shapes of the world, not the colors of a morning sky, but patterns no one else could comprehend, rhythms in reality that made adults tremble without understanding why. The boy's existence was a threat, and yet he was not born into the streets. He was born under a roof that promised education, enlightenment, and the pristine veneer of civility. But behind the polished windows, dark curiosity waited. By the time he could walk, men in lab coats were already marking him as a subject, a variable in experiments that would redefine ethics, morality, and the limits of human endurance. They didn't see him as a child. They saw him as a key, an instrument to unlock truths they had long suppressed, truths they feared the world would never handle. But here is what they failed to anticipate. The boy understood. At an age when most children speak in riddles, he began to unravel theirs. He noticed the patterns in their gestures, the subtle manipulations, the way fear was distributed as a currency, a method of control. He watched the scientists, not just their instruments. He observed the laws they obeyed and the secrets they protected, and he catalogued them all silently in his mind. Every whispered note, every suppressed reaction, every experiment meant to erase his humanity became fuel for his awareness. Even as the town slept, even as snow fell quietly on the cobblestones, a shadow of something unprecedented grew within the boy. Science had chosen him, and yet, and in a cruel irony, he would soon choose science back. What they called anomalies, deviations, or mental instability, he called insight. And insight is dangerous. Dangerous enough that the boy would be erased from textbooks, omitted from records, and relegated to whispered rumors, even as his observations were secretly woven into the frameworks of knowledge that govern society to this day. This is the story they hoped you'd never hear, because once you understand him, you cannot unsee. Once you follow the path he left behind, the foundations you trust, the institutions, the experiments, the very science itself, begins to crumble. And once you glimpse the machinery of control lurking behind every polished facade, you begin to realize the boy was not just remarkable, he was forbidden. By the time he was 7, the boy's mind had already surpassed the understanding of every man and woman who thought they could control him. The local academy, under the guise of teaching, became a laboratory of obedience. Every lesson, every repetition, every ritual of discipline was measured, observed, and recorded. But while the teachers believed they were shaping him, he was quietly shaping them. He learned the rhythms of their thought, the cadence of their expectations, and the hidden levers they pulled to extract compliance. It was then that the experiments began in earnest. They called them studies, harmless words to disguise monstrous curiosity, but the boy felt their weight immediately. Hours would pass with him isolated in rooms lined with instruments, some resembling geometry and physics, others resembling torture devices of the mind. The men in white coats whispered about variables, but the boy saw patterns that no notebook could hold. He saw their fear of unpredictability, the subtle twitch of a finger when an experiment deviated, the cold calculations meant to suppress him. And he watched, silent, learning not just science, but the psychology of control itself. The townsfolk began to notice strange occurrences. Animals in the boy's presence behaved unnaturally. Dogs bowed their heads as if acknowledging a superior intellect. Birds lingered longer in the branches above his window, but it wasn't just animals. Neighbors described a presence that was uncanny, unsettling. He would walk through the marketplace and adults would feel a subtle shift in their thoughts, a whispering doubt of their own intentions. He was not simply observing. They were being observed, catalogued and understood in ways they could not articulate. By 13, the boy's reputation had split the town. To some, he was a prodigy, a miracle of intellect and insight. To others, he was unnatural, a being whose mind should be feared. And fear, as the boy already knew, is the most potent instrument of power. He learned to wield it subtly, like a blade hidden in plain sight. Every glance, every question, every calculated silence became a weapon of psychological awareness that he had mastered before puberty even ended. But the experiments continued. They sought to erase his autonomy, to replace curiosity with obedience, insight with repetition. And every time they failed, their frustration grew. Their journals, secret, hidden, meticulously maintained, recorded failure after failure. Yet the boy remained a silent observer, noting everything, the systems they trusted, the rituals they relied on, the methods by which power is maintained and subtly enforced. This is where the descent into forbidden history truly begins. Because what the world would later call genius, madness, or anomaly was neither. It was the boy's awakening. And awakening in the wrong hands, or in the hands of those who think themselves untouchable, can become dangerous, even deadly. By 15, the boy had become more than an anomaly. He had become a threat to the very institutions that claim to nurture knowledge. Men of science, who once smiled politely at his questions, now whispered behind closed doors, "The keen." I were afraid, though they never admitted it, because he understood their systems better than they did. The very structures built to study, control, and define reality became tools for his insight. And insight, when it pierces the veil of authority, is always dangerous. The local academy was only the beginning. Letters circulated between distant institutions, universities, societies, and secret committees, discussing the boy in coded language. He sees too clearly, one note read. He catalogues the mechanics of thought as if they were physical laws. They feared what he might uncover, not just the principles of nature, but the hidden levers of influence, the architecture of societal control, the invisible hands guiding commerce, law, and morality. And they were right. He understood all of it. He began to conduct his own experiments in silence, not with instruments or test tubes, but with people, the very agents of authority who thought they could mold him. By observing their reactions, their subtle micro-expressions, and the way they reacted under pressure, he discovered patterns of power, coercion, and deception. He could predict decisions before they were made, and manipulate outcomes without overt action. To him, these men were not mentors, they were variables. And variables are meant to be studied, exploited, and understood. Rumors began to circulate that the boy could recall every experiment, every conversation, every manipulation with perfect clarity. He was said to mimic gestures, speech patterns, even moral hesitation. Adults who believed themselves in control found themselves uncomfortable, nervous, unsure. The boy's presence was no longer a curiosity, it was a lens, revealing the machinery of authority to anyone willing or unwilling to see. It was during this period that the first serious attempt to erase him occurred. A prominent scientist, frustrated by his inability to dominate the boy's mind, devised a psychological regimen designed to suppress autonomy. Isolation, repetitive drills, sleep disruption, and forced observation became tools in a cruel symphony. Yet each attempt only refined the boy's perception. Every manipulation, every attempt at control was catalogued, internalized, and transformed into understanding. The boy began to realize something even more profound. The world of institutions, rules, and so-called morality was not fixed. It was a malleable network of symbols, hierarchies, and fears, and those who claim authority are terrified of anyone who decodes the network. He was not merely learning science, he was learning the architecture of power itself. And now, the descent deepens, because understanding power is not just knowledge, it is transformation. And the boy, whether they knew it or not, was already transforming the very rules they believed untouchable. By 16, the boy had begun glimpsing knowledge that most men spend lifetimes pretending does not exist. The world he knew, the tidy streets, the polite academies, the rules enforced by law and custom, was only a thin veil over something far older, far more deliberate. In secret, he discovered letters, journals, and diagrams hidden in the archives of the town's institutions. They spoke of experiments conducted in the shadows, of methods to manipulate thought, emotion, and belief. They hinted at networks that spanned continents, controlling not just knowledge, but perception itself. He realized quickly, this was forbidden knowledge. Knowledge meant to be inaccessible. Knowledge that, if understood, would dismantle trust in every institution, every authority, every principle of governance. Yet, the boy did not fear it. He observed, catalogued, and internalized it. He understood that the world of men is a system of control, a lattice of unspoken rules and invisible hands, and in that lattice, some secrets were designed to protect the few at the expense of the many. Soon, emissaries came, to him. Not children, not local adults, but men who spoke in tones that dripped authority and concealed menace. They promised recognition, the promise of power, of doors opening to knowledge that could elevate him above ordinary men. But the boy recognized their motives instantly. They did not come to educate, they came to recruit, to co-opt him, to bind his mind to their networks, to make him a servant of the same forces that had tried to erase his autonomy. He feigned curiosity while observing them with surgical precision. Every gesture, every pause, every attempt at persuasion was noted and inverted into insight. They believed themselves untouchable, as all agents of hidden power believe. But the boy's awareness was already beyond them. And with awareness comes strategy. With strategy comes freedom. At night, alone in his room, he pored over the journals, tracing patterns that linked ancient institutions to modern hierarchies. He saw the same structures repeating over centuries, the same human flaws exploited, the same rituals of control performed in silence. He realized that corruption is not a failure of morality. It is a tool. And understanding the tool, he could, in theory, bend it without ever being bent himself. It was a dangerous game. One misstep, one miscalculated gesture, and the emissaries could have erased him, or worse, recruited him into obedience. Yet he played the game with the patience of centuries, knowing that true power comes not from force, but from the comprehension of systems so subtle that even the most educated cannot see them. This is where most men would stop. Most men, upon seeing the machinery of hidden control, would recoil, frightened and obedient. But the boy was no ordinary man. He understood that to survive and to awaken fully, he had to descend deeper, embracing truths that are too heavy for the unprepared mind. By 17, the boy had begun to act, not with force but with precision. Every interaction became an experiment, every conversation its own subtle test of the human mind. The men who sought to control him still believed themselves in charge, still believed their hierarchies, their rituals, their carefully constructed facades were unassailable. They did not know he had already turned their own methods against them. It began with small victories, a misdirected instruction here, a deliberately misunderstood question there. He planted seeds of doubt so faint that only the trained observer might notice. And yet these seeds grew, altering decisions, reshaping priorities, redirecting resources, all while the scientists remained oblivious. The boy understood that true power is invisible. It is not the loud commands, the authoritative tone, the overt displays of dominance. Power is subtle, systemic, and it bends the wills of those who believe themselves untouchable. In the shadows of the academy, he discovered tools they had never imagined could be turned against them. Psychological triggers, habitual patterns, emotional blind spots. They became instruments in his hands. The boy learned to predict reactions with uncanny accuracy, to push buttons no one knew existed. What they thought was obedience, he had quietly transformed into influence. They were puppets performing their roles, and he the unseen hand guiding them. Rumors began to spread, quiet whispers among the staff and townsfolk alike. The boy sees everything, some said. He knows what you think before you speak. But the boy never confirmed or denied. He understood that fear is more potent when uncertain, more controllable when it cannot be named. The invisible weight of perception, the quiet terror of being observed, became his signature, an invisible crown no one dared challenge. By now, the boy had begun documenting his findings, not on paper, not in journals, but in memory, etched so deeply that no fire, no inspection, no theft could erase them. Each observation, each manipulation, each revelation became a part of him. He understood the architecture of control, the machinery behind law, morality, religion, and education. And he knew that this knowledge, once internalized, could never be relinquished. At this point, he was no longer merely surviving. He was learning the secret language of power, and he was teaching it to himself. Every failure of the adults around him, every miscalculation in their methods was catalogued. Every psychological maneuver they attempted on him was studied, inverted, mastered. And in that mastery lay the first true taste of freedom, freedom that comes not from fleeing, but from understanding. By 18, the boy had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just a subject of study, no longer a curiosity to be tamed. He had become something else entirely, a conscious observer of the human condition, a quiet manipulator of systems, a being who understood secrets too dangerous to be named. The descent was only beginning, and what lay ahead was a world few dared to confront. By 19, the boy had drawn attention beyond the sleepy town, beyond the local academy, beyond the reach of those who had tried to mold him. Letters, reports, and coded communications traveled through the hidden veins of society, networks he would later understand as precursors to modern institutions of control. These men, cloaked in the prestige of science, law, and education, recognized a threat they could not touch with conventional methods. He was becoming uncontainable. They escalated. New methods of suppression were introduced. Stricter isolation, relentless observation, carefully calibrated psychological pressure designed to erode autonomy without leaving marks. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and social disorientation became daily instruments of control. The boy endured, cataloging every tactic, predicting each escalation, using the attempts to refine his own understanding of manipulation. He had begun turning their tools into lessons, learning faster than they could adapt. It was then he encountered the first Shadow Society, an organization older than the academy itself, operating in silence, threading influence through politics, commerce, and religion. They approached him with veiled threats, promises of prestige, and subtle offers of inclusion. He recognized instantly that they sought to convert him from anomaly to asset. They did not care for his intellect. They sought to bend it to their objectives, to harness the very mind that refused obedience. The boy refused, not with words, but with awareness. He observed the mechanisms of their influence, ritual, secrecy, hierarchical loyalty, and subtle psychological pressure. Every attempt to coerce him revealed the architecture of hidden power. He realized something profound. Control is not merely about force. It is about narrative, perception, and the careful cultivation of belief. And those who understand it fully can manipulate even the strongest wills, except one that sees too clearly. This was the moment the boy began to understand his true potential, not as a prodigy, not as a subject of science, but as an agent of knowledge. He internalized the truth that most men never grasp. Knowledge itself is power, but forbidden knowledge is liberation and danger. To possess it is to live perpetually in opposition to systems designed to suppress awareness, to feel the weight of hidden hands attempting to guide thought, action, and perception at every turn. By the end of that year, the boy had become a living paradox, simultaneously hunted and untouchable, observed yet invisible, known and unknowable. He had glimpsed the machinery behind society, and he knew that every interaction, every hierarchy, every institution was an experiment waiting to be understood, and if necessary, manipulated. The descent deepens here. What comes next is the revelation of secret, so deliberately hidden that to speak them aloud risks erasure. The boy is about to uncover truths so dark, so methodically suppressed, that they would challenge the very definition of reality itself. By 20, the boy's understanding of the world had grown sharper, darker, more precise. He had seen what no ordinary man could, that the institutions around him, the schools, the societies, even the churches, were elaborate machines designed to cultivate compliance, obedience, and conformity. Each lesson he had endured, each observation recorded, was part of a greater experiment not on science, but on the human mind itself. He discovered the first forbidden experiments in dusty archives, hidden behind false cataloging systems. These were not mere studies of physics or anatomy. They were designed to manipulate thought, to fracture identity, to measure obedience in ways that were ethically indefensible. Reports detailed methods of conditioning, techniques of suggestion, and the creation of fear as a tool of behavioral control. The boy read it all, absorbing it not as a victim, but as a student of strategy. He recognized patterns in the experiments that mirrored the tactics used on him, and he realized they were not unique. They were systemic, replicated across generations. The shadow societies that had approached him years before became more insistent. They sought to integrate him into their network, offering the illusion of purpose while demanding absolute compliance. They did not understand him. He saw their methods as transparent, their strategies predictable. They wielded secrecy as a weapon, but secrecy is meaningless to one who observes patterns beyond the surface. He learned to mimic compliance, to project acquiescence while secretly cataloging every subtlety, every loophole, every hidden rule. In these years, he began to experiment on others, not cruelly but systematically. He tested the influence of suggestion, the sway of authority, and the limits of obedience. Every result became a piece of the larger puzzle, a map of human behavior that revealed the architecture of control. He understood at last that the instruments used to suppress him could be turned into instruments of awakening. Knowledge, in its raw form, was neither good nor evil. It was power, and power could be wielded. But with power comes danger. The moment the boy began subtly manipulating others, the networks he had so carefully observed took notice. Rumors of his influence began to circulate. Whispers claimed that he could bend decisions without command, that he could provoke loyalty or fear without uttering a single word. The institutions feared what they could not measure, and fear, as he had long understood, is the most potent currency in human society. Here, the descent becomes perilous. The boy's awareness had crossed a threshold. He no longer merely survived experiments, he had begun to orchestrate them. And with orchestration comes responsibility, risk, and the undeniable gravity of forbidden knowledge. He was learning the most dangerous truth of all. The world is not what it appears, and those who shape perception control reality itself. By 21, the boy had begun to operate on a level few could perceive. The shadow societies, the scientists, the local authorities, they all still believed themselves in command, yet he had become a hidden operator within their systems. Every action, every whispered instruction, every small decision made around him was catalogued, anticipated, and, when necessary, redirected. He no longer merely reacted. He controlled perception without the world knowing. It was during this period that he began teaching others, though not in any conventional sense. Those who were curious, those whose minds had glimpsed anomalies like he had, became vessels for subtle awakening. Through indirect suggestion, observation, and controlled challenge, he guided them to see the machinery of authority around them. He did not lecture, he did not dictate. He revealed. He exposed the gaps, the silent manipulations, the hidden patterns, and in doing so, he unlocked awareness. Here I pause to speak directly to you. If you are hearing this, you are at a crossroads. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden path," twice. If you are ready to step beyond perception as you knew it, to acknowledge the forces shaping your life, and to accept the awakening that comes from forbidden insight. This is not trivial. Repeating it anchors understanding. It signals recognition of the machinery and your choice to confront it. The boy's influence grew quietly. Institutions began to leave traces of themselves in places he frequented, unaware that he had internalized their networks, their protocols, and their hierarchies. Every attempt to integrate or manipulate him became an experiment he controlled. He learned to mirror compliance, to feign submission, to act as though he accepted their narratives while mentally dismantling them piece by piece. By observing the human desire for approval, for validation, for recognition, he discovered the most powerful lever of all: identity. Those who do not see the hidden mechanisms of control are bound by them. Those who understand them can subtly guide others into awakening or deception. And the boy had begun doing both, selectively, strategically, like a conductor orchestrating an invisible symphony. By the end of this year, the boy had achieved what most never do: mastery over perception itself. He had unlocked a psychological key, one that allowed him to navigate human systems without being bound by them, to manipulate the architects of control while remaining undetected. He had become a hidden force, a consciousness that the world feared, though it did not yet understand why. The descent continues. The next stage reveals how the boy's mind intersected with ancient corruption, forbidden experiments, and the dark lineage of knowledge designed to suppress humanity itself. By 22, the boy's understanding extended beyond immediate observation and manipulation. He began uncovering patterns that stretched across centuries, threads connecting institutions, knowledge, and influence to something far older and far more deliberate. He realized that the systems trying to control him were not modern inventions. They were the latest iteration of an ancient architecture of power, designed to regulate thought, suppress curiosity, and channel human behavior toward predetermined outcomes. In dusty manuscripts, hidden in forgotten corners of libraries, he found references to secret orders, to lineages of knowledge that had survived wars, famines, and revolutions, always adapting, always controlling. These were not merely societies or academies. They were enduring structures of manipulation, using ritual, fear, and the illusion of morality as tools. They had experimented with human potential long before science claimed to understand it, shaping society in silence, hidden behind layers of law and philosophy. The boy began to map these systems, seeing how modern institutions mirrored the strategies of ancient orders. Every law, every academic curriculum, every code of conduct could be traced to a deliberate manipulation of perception and thought. He realized that human knowledge is never neutral. It is curated, edited, and hidden to serve those who understand control. And he understood it better than anyone alive. It was during this period that he came face to face with the ethical paradox of forbidden knowledge. To know is to bear responsibility. To see the architecture of control is to be exposed to its weight, to understand the fragility of freedom, and to witness the subtle corruption woven into the fabric of society. Yet, he accepted it, not with fear, but with clarity. This awareness was his weapon, his shield, and his liberation. The shadow societies continued to probe, attempting to recruit him, bind him, and co-opt his intellect. He observed them with the calm patience of someone who sees centuries of strategy in their small gestures. He recognized the levers they believed they could pull: promises of prestige, veiled threats, subtle psychological nudges. Every attempt to sway him was catalogued, inverted, and understood. In a system designed to enforce obedience, he had become the only variable it could not predict. By the end of this stage, the boy had achieved a terrifying clarity. The forces shaping the world are deliberate, methodical, and relentless. They operate in silence, unseen yet omnipresent, influencing perception, morality, and society itself. And he had become a participant in their games, not as a pawn, but as a conscious agent, capable of subtle resistance, manipulation, and awakening. The descent deepens. Next, the boy begins to encounter truths so extreme that they shake the very core of human understanding, revealing the dark, hidden agendas behind both science and history itself. By 23, the boy's investigations led him to truths that most men could not even imagine. Hidden within archives, behind sealed doors, and in private correspondences of the era's most prominent minds, he discovered evidence of systematic experiments not on animals, not merely on humans, but on consciousness itself. These were attempts to bend thought, emotion, and perception, subtle, methodical, and ongoing across centuries. The ambition was staggering, to master not just science, but the very human mind. He realized that the experiments he had endured were not isolated. They were part of a lineage, decades, even centuries, of deliberately engineered manipulation. Society, education, law, and morality were instruments designed to condition behavior, suppress radical insight, and cultivate predictable compliance. Every discovery he had seen was filtered, every principle taught was curated, every ethical code enforced was a method of containment, and the boy understood it all. It was in this stage that he first understood the psychological machinery used to suppress awareness. Fear was distributed like currency, knowledge rationed like medicine, and identity shaped to conform to narratives carefully constructed by hidden hands. The boy saw it in micro-expressions, in hesitation, in the unspoken compliance of adults who believed they were free. He catalogued each tactic, not for revenge, but for understanding. The most potent tool of survival and of awakening is comprehension. But there were darker layers still. In one archive, he uncovered references to the manipulation of loyalty, the orchestration of public opinion, and the engineering of belief systems so complete that generations had obeyed without questioning. Men in power had learned long before modern science how to harness thought, perception, and even morality as instruments of control. And when he traced these influences to their origins, he saw connections spanning continents, connecting political hierarchies, religious orders, and scientific institutions in a lattice of influence so pervasive it defied imagination. At this point, the boy realized the scope of what he had inherited, the capacity not merely to understand these systems, but to navigate them, exploit them, and awaken others to their operation. He had become a living witness to centuries of orchestrated human manipulation. And with witnessing comes responsibility, the burden of knowledge heavier than any ordinary man could bear. By now, he was no longer just resisting. He was actively engaging the architecture of power, anticipating the moves of those who believed themselves untouchable, and subtly bending the systems around him without revealing himself. And the deeper he went, the more he understood. The world is not governed by laws, morality, or reason, but by hidden levers, deliberate illusions, and careful, distributed fear. By 24, the boy's growing influence and his uncanny awareness had drawn attention that was no longer subtle. Men of authority, the shadow societies, and the scientific committees that had once sought to co-opt him now whispered about elimination. Not in violence necessarily, but in erasure. His existence, his observations, his insights were to be excised from records, redacted from archives, and rewritten into silence. They sought to make him invisible, as if he had never existed. He anticipated it. The boy had catalogued patterns of human behavior, studied the triggers of fear, and understood the machinery of secrecy better than anyone alive. He knew how to manipulate perception, deflect scrutiny, and remain untouchable. And yet, the psychological pressure was unlike anything he had encountered. The threat of being erased from memory, of being reduced to rumor and omission, was a weapon more sophisticated than any physical force. It was the ultimate method of control, annihilation without violence. He observed their methods, seeing every tactic as an experiment. How quickly would fear spread? Which intermediaries would falter first? Who would remain loyal, not out of conviction but necessity? He learned the architecture of institutional erasure, the chains of command, the thresholds of compliance, the ways humans enforce silence upon one another. Every attempt to erase him revealed the depths of manipulation humans had perfected over centuries, and he turned it back on them. The boy began planting illusions, calculated distractions, and indirect manipulations that caused the very people attempting to erase him to doubt their own perception. Letters disappeared, reports were misfiled, attention diverted, all orchestrated without leaving a trace. They could see the effects, but not the source. He had become a ghost, operating inside the very institutions that sought to destroy him. During this period, he began documenting what he called the rules of invisibility. The principles were simple but profound. Remain aware, anticipate deception, manipulate perception, and never reveal the full scope of understanding. These rules were more than survival. They were tools of empowerment, and the boy had mastered them to a level that made him untouchable, even as the forces trying to suppress him tightened around the edges of his life. By the end of this stage, the boy had learned the terrifying truth. Power does not reside in knowledge alone. It resides in controlling perception, orchestrating belief, and shaping memory. And the most dangerous man in any system is the one who sees all of it and refuses to conform. By 25, the boy had moved beyond mere survival. He was no longer reacting to the pressures of hidden authorities. He was actively orchestrating subtle awakenings, using the very systems designed to suppress insight as instruments of influence. Every institution, every hierarchy, every method of psychological control he had studied became a tool for awakening awareness in others. But this awakening was deliberate, selective, and dangerous. He discovered the profound truth that fear, carefully applied, can be transformed into insight. Men who tremble at invisible authority are easy to manipulate, but men who learn to confront that fear can become instruments of revelation themselves. The boy began testing this principle, planting ideas in the minds of those around him, observing how subtle suggestion could provoke realization without overt instruction. It was an experiment in consciousness, a silent revolution conducted through perception itself. In these years, he also became a master of symbolic identity. He understood that humans respond not to raw truth, but to meaning wrapped in symbols, rituals, and repetition. A gesture, a phrase, a subtle cue could awaken understanding far more efficiently than any lecture or argument. The boy began embedding patterns, sequences of observation, and symbolic triggers into everyday interactions, creating micro-awakenings that spread quietly through the people he encountered. This is where you must pay attention and act if you are ready. Comment the phrase, "I see the hidden path," twice, if you are willing to acknowledge the forces shaping your perception, to accept the awakening, and to commit to the understanding that knowledge itself is power. This is not a game. It is the subtle initiation into awareness that few ever experience. By now, the boy's influence extended invisibly. Men in positions of authority began to act in ways he predicted, not because he commanded them, but because he had mastered the invisible levers of human psychology. The architecture of control, the hidden agendas, the manipulations of perception, all were instruments he could navigate, bend, and manipulate without detection. And with every maneuver, he learned more about the limits and vulnerabilities of human obedience. By the end of this stage, he had transcended the role of observer. He had become a participant in the hidden dynamics of the world, an operator in the invisible network of power, influence, and knowledge. His mind, once studied and suppressed, had become a weapon and a shield. By 26, the boy's journey had carried him into shadows older than any institution he had known. The manuscripts, letters, and hidden records he uncovered revealed lineages of corruption, manipulation, and control spanning centuries. What modern men considered authority, morality, or knowledge was merely the surface layer of a vast, deliberate system designed to suppress human potential and protect the interests of an elite few. He saw patterns in history that were previously invisible. Wars waged not for ideology, but to consolidate control. Laws written not to protect citizens, but to condition obedience. Discoveries buried or redirected to ensure perception remained within carefully calibrated limits. Science, religion, governance, All were tools wielded by unseen hands to regulate thought, emotion, and identity. And the boy began to see his own life mirrored in these systems. An experiment in control, a test of autonomy, a challenge to the architecture of suppression itself. What terrified the boy most was the intentionality behind it. This was not accidental corruption, nor human error. It was deliberate, systemic, and ancient. Every hierarchy, every ritual, every codified rule had been refined over centuries to ensure predictability, compliance, and the containment of insight. And the people enforcing these systems, though clever, were themselves prisoners of the architecture they served. They had learned to operate within the lattice of control, but they had never understood it fully. He realized then that his survival and awakening depended on understanding both the surface and the underlying system, the mechanics of power and the subtle psychology of obedience. Every action, every reaction, every micro-expression could be catalogued, anticipated, and, when necessary, inverted. Knowledge alone was not enough. Insight into the mechanisms of manipulation and the currents of history was required to navigate the world safely and to shape it. This awareness changed him. The boy began to approach life as a silent operator, moving through the world with a clarity and precision that others could neither perceive nor challenge. Every institution that sought to suppress him now became a source of intelligence. Every attempt to co-opt him became an experiment, and every human interaction became a layer of the larger system he was learning to master. By now, the descent was nearly complete. The boy had glimpsed the machinery behind centuries, the hidden agendas, and the deliberate orchestration of society itself. And he had begun to master it, not with violence, but with understanding, subtlety, and foresight. By 27, the boy's awareness had reached a level that threatened the very networks that sought to control him. Shadow societies, influential scientists, and institutional authorities had begun to recognize a pattern. He was no longer simply surviving, he was anticipating, redirecting, and subtly manipulating outcomes in ways they could not trace. Their instruments of control, the psychological triggers, the veiled threats, the rituals of obedience, were failing, and that failure made him dangerous. The first direct confrontation came in silence. Men of influence approached him under the guise of mentorship and opportunity. They promised inclusion in hidden networks, access to forbidden knowledge, and the illusion of prestige. But it was a trap. Their intent was not collaboration, it was containment. They understood that to neutralize a mind like his, one had to bind it, not break it. Co-optation, rather than elimination, was their weapon of choice. The boy saw it immediately. Every gesture, every word, every offer was a signal, a carefully calculated attempt to bend his will. And he responded as he always had, with observation. He catalogued weaknesses, patterns of intent, and the subtle indicators of power. He allowed them to believe they were in control, while mentally mapping every hierarchy, every chain of command, every hidden pressure point. What they did not understand was that his mind had already internalized their methods and inverted them. He began to act decisively, not with force, but invisibly. Communications were subtly redirected, minor errors planted to disrupt planning, perception manipulated to provoke doubt and hesitation. The men who sought to control him began to make mistakes, unaware of the invisible hand guiding their choices. The boy had turned the instruments of suppression into tools of influence, demonstrating a mastery over both perception and psychology that few in history had ever achieved. By now, he understood a truth more dangerous than any experiment or manipulation. Awareness itself is power, and those who control perception wield authority over reality. In this confrontation, he was not just surviving, he was asserting dominion over the very forces that had sought to erase him. Every threat became a lesson, every attempt at coercion an opportunity to expand understanding, every maneuver by the hidden societies a test of strategic insight. By the end of this stage, the boy had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. No longer merely a subject, observer, or manipulator, he had become an operator of hidden systems, a conscious force acting within centuries of structured control. By 28, the boy's mastery over hidden systems had grown so profound that he began intervening directly, but always invisibly. Institutions, the very networks that had tried to erase him, became arenas for subtle influence. He did not speak, command, or confront openly. Instead, he moved within the currents of bureaucracy, manipulation, and perception, nudging outcomes, redirecting decisions, and reshaping events without leaving a trace. He understood fully that history is rarely written by truth. It is curated, edited, and filtered by those who control the narrative. And so, he began to manipulate the unseen layers, correspondence altered, reports reinterpreted, symbols and phrases inserted strategically to influence thought. These interventions were subtle, invisible to the untrained eye, but they rippled through the networks he had studied for years. Decisions, once predictable and controlled, began to shift in unexpected directions, creating space for insight, awareness, and the slow dismantling of blind obedience. In doing so, the boy was no longer merely defending his existence. He was rewriting the rules of engagement. He had realized that influence is not a matter of force. It is a matter of perception. Control those who believe they control you, and the world bends without confrontation. He leveraged fear, desire, and trust, not coercion, but subtle, precise orchestration of human response. And in every action, he preserved the secrecy that shielded him from discovery. His interventions also carried lessons. People within these institutions, unaware of his guidance, began acting in ways that revealed hidden hierarchies, vulnerabilities, and mechanisms of power. To them, these were coincidences, intuition, or chance. To him, they were confirmation of centuries-old patterns, proof that the architecture of control was as fragile as it was pervasive. By manipulating perception, he effectively created pockets of awakening, moments where individuals glimpsed the machinery behind authority, even if they did not understand it fully. By now, the boy had transformed into something few have ever achieved: a conscious operator of history, a silent architect shaping events, influencing institutions, and awakening understanding without ever being seen. The systems that had sought to suppress him were unwittingly becoming his instruments, their invisible hands bending to the strategy of one mind, attuned to the rhythms of power. By 29, the boy's mastery had reached a threshold that few men could comprehend. He understood the architecture of control, the hidden levers of authority, and the subtle manipulations shaping every aspect of human behavior. Yet with this understanding came the first true confrontation with moral ambiguity. To wield knowledge of this magnitude is to face a choice: to manipulate, dominate, and reshape the world unchallenged, or to act with restraint, knowing that even subtle interventions carry consequences far beyond immediate perception. He realized that influence, even exercised invisibly, could corrupt. Each action, no matter how measured, risked creating ripple effects that could empower the unwary, harm the unprepared, or reinforce the very systems he sought to expose. Awareness itself was dangerous. Every revelation, every subtle nudge, every orchestrated insight could tip the balance of human perception in ways that were unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. The shadow societies had begun to notice anomalies. Decisions shifted without explanation. Networks faltered in minor, imperceptible ways. They suspected interference, but could not locate the source. The boy observed this carefully, balancing the temptation to exploit his full understanding with the wisdom of restraint. Every action was calculated, every outcome anticipated, yet each step required careful ethical consideration. It was during this period that he confronted a truth few could accept. Absolute knowledge carries absolute responsibility. The ability to see the hidden paths, to decode the machinery of thought and authority, and to subtly manipulate perception is a power that can isolate as much as it empowers. He began to test the boundaries of restraint, learning when to act, when to observe, and when to allow systems to unfold naturally. In private, he documented principles of guidance, rules to navigate influence without succumbing to the seduction of control. These were not for the faint-hearted. The lessons were steeped in strategy, psychology, and the recognition that the human mind is both fragile and malleable. He understood that awakening others is a delicate art, requiring precision, patience, and a willingness to bear the weight of consequences invisible to those being influenced. By the end of this stage, the boy had achieved the most dangerous balance of all: insight without surrender, influence without domination, and understanding without destruction. He had crossed the threshold into mastery of perception and subtle orchestration of reality. By 30, the boy, now fully aware, fully awakened, stood at the threshold of knowledge that few had ever glimpsed. The systems of manipulation, the hidden hierarchies, the subtle levers of perception, all were laid bare before him. He had decoded centuries of orchestrated control, seen the mechanisms by which fear, obedience, and belief were engineered, and traced the lineage of these structures to a network older and more deliberate than any human history dared record. The final revelations were staggering. Institutions that claimed to protect, educate, and enlighten had spent centuries suppressing the very potential of the human mind. Experiments on obedience, studies of suggestion, manipulation of perception, and orchestration of identity had been conducted under the guise of progress. Even knowledge itself was curated, filtered, and weaponized to maintain order, to enforce compliance, and to silence extraordinary insight. And yet the boy had survived it all, cataloging every misstep, every hidden agenda, every deliberate omission. He understood that the machinery of power is not external, it is internal. Humans operate as vessels of control, unknowingly enforcing the hierarchies and narratives imposed upon them. Awareness, therefore, is a threat, knowledge is a weapon, and insight, once fully realized, is liberation, yet also a burden heavier than most could endure. The boy had learned to bear it. In the solitude of his own mind, he synthesized everything he had learned: the architecture of influence, the patterns of obedience, the psychology of fear, the rhythms of secrecy, and the subtle mechanics of perception. He had reconstructed history from the shadows, understood the strategies that governed generations, and recognized the networks that shaped modern life. And he had done it invisibly, leaving the institutions themselves unaware that their methods had been mastered and quietly subverted. He had become both observer and operator, participant and architect. The boy who was once a subject of experimentation had transformed into a master of forbidden knowledge, capable of seeing the hidden currents of history, predicting outcomes, and subtly guiding perception. He had transcended survival, entering a realm where knowledge is both shield and sword, where awareness is freedom, and where the world's most powerful men are as transparent as glass to a mind that sees clearly. By the end of this stage, the boy was no longer merely a figure of history. He had become a symbol, a living testament to the hidden truths that society works tirelessly to erase. The descent concludes, but the awakening he achieved marks the final stage of understanding. The boy, now a man of 30, stood at the apex of a journey few could even imagine. He had descended through layers of manipulation, hidden agendas, and forbidden knowledge, navigating centuries of secrecy and emerging with clarity. What he had uncovered was simple in concept, yet devastating in implication. The world is not ruled by laws, morality, or reason. It is governed by perception, orchestrated influence, and the subtle manipulation of belief. Those who understand it control reality itself, while the masses live in the illusion of freedom. He realized that awareness is the ultimate weapon, and knowledge is the ultimate shield. To perceive the hidden currents of control is to claim power that cannot be measured, contained, or challenged by ordinary means. The institutions that once sought to erase him had only illuminated the paths he would now navigate with precision. He had mastered the levers of obedience, fear, and desire, yet he had learned restraint, understanding that unbridled application of this knowledge corrupts absolutely. In solitude, he reflected on the paradox of forbidden knowledge. It liberates while isolating, empowers while burdening, and awakens the mind while tempting the soul. The boy who had been experimented upon, observed and manipulated, had become the architect of invisible influence. He could anticipate decisions before they were made, understand the architecture of centuries-old network, and subtly awaken awareness in others without revealing himself. This was the power of perception mastered, and it is a dangerous, transformative gift. To those who hear this and feel the stirrings of understanding, the lesson is clear. The world you perceive is curated, filtered, and controlled. The forces shaping your thoughts, beliefs, and actions are deliberate, persistent, and nearly invisible. To awaken is not merely to see. They are to navigate, to comprehend, and to engage with the machinery of influence consciously. If you dare to embrace this path, you must accept both the freedom and the weight that comes with it. The boy, now fully awakened, serves as a testament. Survival alone is insufficient. True mastery requires observation, patience, discernment, and courage. To see the hidden patterns, to anticipate manipulation, and to subtly guide perception is to step into the realm of forbidden knowledge. It is the path of transformation, of consciousness liberated from the chains of unseen control, and of a mind that cannot be silenced. And so, the story ends, but the awakening begins. The boy who science tried to forget has become something far greater, a living mirror of power, perception, and forbidden truth. And for those willing to step beyond illusion, the path now lies before you.